Vigor stood with the blue flag of his team tightly gripped in his hand, rallying his teammates with loud and forceful energy. He urged them to stop standing idle, pushing them to realize that this was their chance to rise and finally prove themselves against the arrogant House Elmheim. His voice carried determination as he declared that they would stake everything on the Seven Wings and fight with full conviction. His teammates reacted with shock and confusion at the sudden burst of intensity. Several of them looked around in uncertainty, some even scratching their heads as they tried to process the situation unfolding in front of them. Meanwhile, Aster observed the scene internally and identified at least one person who had taken initiative. Considering him a starting point, he acknowledged that while this reduced the burden of raising flags alone, it was still far from sufficient. In his mind, he knew he needed far more allies if he truly wanted to completely overthrow House Elmheim. Elsewhere, a worried subordinate cautiously approached Lord Gurion, asking if he was all right. Gurion was found in a kneeling position, visibly weakened. When others moved in to assist him, he reacted with sudden fury, harshly pushing their hands away and insulting them as frightened and useless individuals unworthy of touching him. A deep rage burned in Gurion's eyes as he clenched his teeth and tightened his fists. He dismissed the idea of overturning House Elmheim as something absurd, scorning the Yoli branch house and referring to them as worthless. His frustration escalated as he blamed others for acting freely without consequence and felt shame at having to face the main house. He insisted inwardly that he was different from his brother and refused to let everything end in such a disgraceful manner. At that moment, a voice emerged from behind him, addressing Elmheim directly and remarking on the situation, noting that it had been a while and observing the state he was currently in. Gurion turned around to see Nolan standing there. The sight of Nolan reignited a spark of hope within him, as he briefly considered the possibility of still being able to bring Aster down. However, his arrogant pride quickly resurfaced. Instead of relief, he directed his frustration toward Nolan, aggressively blaming him for not handling the situation, and accusing him of failing his responsibility to deal with Aster all this time. Gurion's expression twisted into a disturbing, almost psychotic grin as a chain of dark thoughts formed in his mind, all circling around the idea of eliminating Aster. He convinced himself that their situation still had one powerful asset on their side, even though this particular individual did not carry the same wing emblem as the Seven Wings. Gurion reasoned that, when it came to pure swordsmanship, this person was undeniably the strongest warrior present. Driven by this belief, Gurion immediately issued a harsh and urgent command, ordering Nolan to quickly eliminate the target without hesitation. The atmosphere tightened with tension as the command echoed across the group. In a sudden and defiant response, Nolan threw a red flag directly toward Gurion's face, interrupting the escalation. Gurion froze in shock as the flag struck its mark. Nolan then calmly declared that he had come to return their team flag, making his stance unmistakably clear. Nolan followed this with a cold, arrogant glare, stating that Gurion's methods were in direct opposition to his personal code of chivalry. He further emphasized that this act effectively marked the breaking of their alliance. Gurion stood stunned, as if thunder had struck directly over his head. His anger surged as he reacted in disbelief to the rejection and defiance shown toward him. The surrounding members of the group became visibly unsettled, their confusion deepening as they began whispering among themselves. They expressed shock that even House Nolan appeared to have betrayed them, and uncertainty spread rapidly as no one could determine who they were supposed to follow anymore. Amid this chaos, Nolan slowly drew his sword, calmly stating that the situation had reset back to its starting point. He emphasized that in this examination, no one could simply proceed without resolving matters with him first. His tone made it clear that confrontation was unavoidable. Aster glanced toward Nolan with a calm and unreadable expression. Observing the shift in momentum, Nolan pointed his sword directly at Aster and declared that it would be House Nolan's proud swordsmanship against the so-called Seven Wings. Both warriors stepped into combat positions as tension peaked between them. Nolan's body began to radiate a yellow, thunder-like aura, crackling with intensity and aggression. In contrast, Aster's presence shifted into a powerful red aura, steady and energetic, signaling controlled strength. Nolan charged forward with explosive speed, declaring his intent to immediately establish superiority in battle. However, Aster responded with a darkened, composed expression, refusing to be rushed and stating that such conclusions would need to wait. Their swords collided with tremendous force, Echoing across the battlefield, Aster successfully blocked Nolan's attack, stopping his momentum completely. Nolan's eyes widened in shock as he struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. He gritted his teeth internally, realizing that this opponent was fundamentally different from what he had encountered before. Aster maintained his stance and, in the same moment of exchange, managed to subtly cut into Nolan's sword with precise control. Further shocking him, Nolan was forced to leap backward, distancing himself while trying to process the situation. Despite the clash, Nolan insisted that delaying the confrontation was unacceptable. He reminded Aster that only one team could pass the exam, and emphasized that if both of them aimed to become Kingdom Knights, settling the score was inevitable in that very moment. Aster responded calmly, explaining that such an outcome would be problematic for him personally. He revealed that his intention was for Nolan to also become a Kingdom Knight, surprising everyone around them. Nolan's eyes widened in disbelief at this unexpected statement. Struggling to interpret its meaning, Aster continued by explaining that after rallying everyone with the idea of defeating House Elmham, it would be contradictory to simply abandon Nolan's dream due to team divisions. He expressed that such an outcome would feel wrong and counterproductive. He then revealed that he already had a plan to ensure that everyone present could pass the exam. Although he acknowledged that success was not guaranteed, he expressed strong confidence in its potential if executed properly. However, he emphasized that absolute cooperation from every individual was essential for the plan to work. Aster then approached Gurion directly, extending his hand with a calm smile, signaling an intent to resolve their conflict and stabilize their fractured relationships. Gurion remained visibly shocked by this unexpected gesture. As the exam reached its conclusion, Aster implemented his strategy. Under his direction, all teams combined the blue, red, and yellow flags together and raised them collectively. This unconventional action immediately drew the attention of the instructors. The instructor reacted with visible shock and irritation, raising their voice in frustration while questioning the meaning behind what had just been done. Confusion spread across the entire examination area as the unusual outcome defied expectations. Aster remained calm and explained that the victory condition required the occupation of 2 or more bases. He further clarified that since it had never been explicitly stated that only one team could raise a flag at a single base, a different interpretation was possible. Based on this reasoning, he coordinated all 3 teams to jointly occupy all bases together. This conclusion left the remaining participants stunned and uncertain, as they exchanged nervous glances while trying to understand how the situation had been turned completely on its head through strategic interpretation and collective cooperation. The instructor's expression darkened into a sharp death glare as he stepped directly toward Aster, his anger building with every step. He accused Aster of trying to twist the entire exam, questioning whether the intention was to force everyone to pass, and mocking the integrity of the evaluation itself. Vigor, standing nearby, reacted with a nervous jolt. Overwhelmed by the situation, he immediately concluded that the idea of such an outcome had always been impossible from the start, his fear confirming the same doubt shared by many others. Gurion followed with a cold, dismissive judgment, stating that naturally such sophistry could never be accepted within a formal exam structure, reinforcing the belief that Aster's interpretation was flawed and unrealistic. The instructor continued his aggressive approach, glaring directly at Aster and drawing a strict comparison. He questioned whether, if ordered to invade and destroy an enemy territory, a knight would simply shake hands with the enemy and return without fulfilling the mission. The implication was clear. Duty and obedience were meant to override personal interpretation. Aster responded calmly, stating that such an action would only make sense if the enemy in question held more value alive than destroyed, implying that rigid destruction was not always the correct measure of judgment. Behind him, Nolan silently observed the exchange and subtly nodded, showing that he understood and partially agreed with Aster's perspective. Adding weight to the tension in the room, the instructor's anger intensified further as he declared that a knight is the sword of the nation, and that it is not the place of participants to make such judgments themselves. Authority, discipline, and obedience were meant to define their actions, not personal reasoning. Aster then challenged this authority directly, asking whether, under those conditions, they would simply choose to disqualify everyone present. He further argued that as long as their interpretation did not violate the written rules, Dismissing it outright would simply reflect the examiner's personal bias rather than the framework of the exam itself. The instructor crossed his arms, his expression shifting slightly as he began to think more carefully about the argument. The rigidity in his stance softened just enough to suggest that the logic being presented could not be dismissed easily, and the situation required deeper consideration. Aster leaned in slightly and lowered his voice, adding another critical point. He suggested that if, by following strict interpretation alone, the result ended in the failure of all participants, it would raise serious questions about the judgment of those overseeing the exam, and whether such an outcome truly aligned with the intent of the main house. This statement pushed the instructor further into silent contemplation, his irritation gradually replaced by complex uncertainty, as the implications of total failure began to weigh more heavily on his mind. The scene then shifted to all the contestants gathered together. Waiting under tense silence, Vigor sat beside Aster, visibly restless and anxious. He noted that they had already been ordered to stand by the examiner who had gone to confirm the situation, and that an entire hour had already passed without any resolution. He expressed growing concern, questioning whether they would truly be safe under these conditions, and fearing that the entire group might end up failing together due to the controversy surrounding the decision. Aster remained calm and responded that, at the very least, they had demonstrated that the situation was worth serious discussion. He believed that forcing the system to acknowledge their interpretation was already a meaningful step forward. As he spoke, he glanced toward Gurion, who was sitting apart with his usual confident and cocky posture still intact, though now slightly more restrained due to the uncertainty surrounding the outcome. Vigor quietly leaned toward Aster and asked what exactly had been said to Gurion to make him even remotely cooperative. Sensing a shift in attitude that had not been there before, Aster responded with a faint smirk, downplaying the exchange and saying that nothing particularly major had been said, leaving the true impact of his words unspoken but clearly effective. At that moment, the doors to the hall suddenly opened. Breaking the tension, several instructors entered first, followed closely by the principal, whose presence immediately shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. The instructor formally announced that Principal Mimir would now declare the results of the exam, instructing everyone to listen carefully as the final decision was about to be revealed. Principal Mimir then stepped forward calmly into the room, his composed presence immediately commanding attention from all the candidates, as the entire group waited in silence for the outcome that would decide their fate.